Learning Objective 3 walks us through how we use a production cost report and the weighted average method of accounting for inventory cost to track cost through the process costing system. Okay, so let's take a look at how that happens. When we talked about job order costing in the prior chapter, remember we just had one complete process to complete that job, and all of the costs were contained to that particular job. Once again, in process costing, we're going to have some costs that are taking place not only in a job, but in the different processes in that job. So as you'll see in the flow chart that we have here, we have an assembly process and we have a cutting process. The illustration in your text walks you through a puzzle manufacturer. Okay, so if you think about the assembly process that's going on with manufacturing a puzzle, the direct materials are the cardboard that the puzzle is glued to, the glue that is used to get the picture onto that cardboard. And so we have different direct materials for the assembly process than we would for the cutting process. In the cutting process, your book tells you that we are cutting the cardboard that has come in from the assembly process, and we are packaging it up. So the direct materials that take place in the cutting process only involve the box. Cutting the materials that came to us, okay, from the assembly department down to the cutting department, and then we add the box. So the materials are different in each process. The same thing with the labor. The assembly process has its own labor, those who are using the pressing machines to get the picture onto the cardboard. In the cutting process, we have labor that is actually cutting the puzzle and putting it into the box. The manufacturing overhead likewise would be different. But what happens is the assembly process takes place first, and when everything in the assembly process has been completed, it gets moved, as you will see. This says partially completed puzzles. So everything that's still in the assembly process is still a partially completed puzzle. But once those puzzles are complete, we can see the flow chart here that moves us through. Once they are complete, all the costs for those puzzles move down to the cutting process or the cutting department. And you will see later in this video, these are considered transferred in cost. Now we have the cost from the assembly process moved down to the cutting process. And now that the cost and the physical units have been moved, we will begin to track the material, the labor, and overhead that takes place in the cutting process. Once again, while all of these costs are in the cutting process, they are partially completed puzzles. But once they're finished, the total cost will come out of the cutting process and will move to finished goods for the completed puzzles. Okay, so that's kind of our picture of what's taking place. We need to track those costs, and the production cost report that we see here shows us how to do that. To do two specific things. Okay, we're going to track the physical flow, how many puzzles were started, how many were still in process, how many got moved to the next department. So we're going to look at the physical flow via units, hence our equivalent units of production, but we're also going to look at the cost flows, because ultimately I need to know what the total cost was in each department so that I know what the total cost was for the job, so that I can break that down into a per unit cost for everything that we have produced. Okay, so our production cost report helps us do that. So it will help us summarize the flow of these physical units. Okay, we're also, in order to do that, we're going to look at our output. Okay, and our output from one department to the next department to finished goods to cost of goods sold is going to be based on the equivalent units of completed goods. Okay, so we'll need to figure out first the physical flow, as we'll see in the following illustrations, and what is the equivalent of finished units that we have produced in that department. Then we'll begin to track the cost per equivalent unit. So why do we need to do this? Because I still need to assign cost per unit to those costs that have been completed and need to move to the next process. So let's see how that begins to work. All right, so your book talks about two distinct terms. One is to account for and one is accounted for. All right, so to account for means we need to know how many units and or dollars, okay, two separate things for each of these. We need to know how many units and how many dollars were in this particular department in process at the beginning of the period. And then we need to know how many additional units were started or added during the period. Those are the total number of units and the total cost that I need to account for. Okay, so what are we talking about? What were the units or the costs that were in process at the beginning of the period? How many units and how much cost have I added during this period? Because remember, in process costing, the cost will move from one process to the next at the end of the period. Unlike in job order costing, they move from work in process when they were complete directly to finished goods. All right, so in this situation, we have work in process accounts for every process that we have. All right, so once again, how many did we have in process at the beginning and what were the costs at the beginning? How many units did we add during the period and how much cost did we add during the period? That is the amount of units and the amount of cost that we need to account for. So at the end of the period, those units, we have two options here. Notice it says either the items that we have started are either still in process, that means they have not been completed yet, and they will remain in that department until the next period when they do get completed, or they have been completed this period and they need to be transferred out. Transferred where? To the next process. Okay, so to account for and accounted for are terms you'll need to become familiar with as we work through this objective. Right, so we get our first look at the production cost report with this illustration. I strongly encourage you to open up your text and follow this illustration in the text, which gives you a little more detail, but I want to walk you through it. So if you will notice in your text, we begin this production cost report with units. Okay, we have to account for units and cost, but we always have to start with units. So once again, we are talking about the assembly department in this particular case. And we know that in the assembly department, we're assuming this is their first department. They only have two in the puzzle department. So this is the first. It said they had 0 units in work in process at the beginning of the period. So this is a fresh batch. This is a fresh start. A good place to start with a process in this illustration. But we started 50,000 puzzles during this month. So we've got 50,000 units that we need to account for. Okay, so you'll see this here. We've got 50,000 that we need to account for. So at the end of the period, I need to know what happened to those 50,000 units. Okay, and the illustration in the book tells you that 40,000 of those puzzles were completed in the assembly department and they were transferred over to the next department. Okay, but 10,000 of those puzzles were not complete and they need to stay here in assembly until they're finished, and then they can be moved to the next process. All right, so I've determined the total number of units, but I need to know out of these 10,000 units that are left in ending work in process, they're only partially completed. But in order for me to track cost, I need to know total cost divided by the total number of units. And I can't divide total cost by 50,000 because these 40,000 units have more cost associated with them that are complete than the 10,000 that are not. The 10,000 doesn't have all of the material and conversion costs related to them yet. So what do we do? Let's walk through this. Since we started the period with 0, there is nothing transferred in. We'll address this in the next process, so just leave this alone for now. But your text tells you that in the assembly department, that this product gets all of its direct materials at the beginning of the period. Okay, so in this particular case, if we had 40,000 units, they have gotten all of their materials because they're complete. Notice this is they're complete. We're going to move those to the next process. Okay, so they have 100% of the materials that they need. So it's the equivalent of 40,000 completed units. All right, the 10,000 units that are still in ending work in process, once again, It says that materials were added at the beginning of the process, so even though they're still in work in process, they have 100%, if I can highlight this for you, they have 100% of their materials because they were added at the beginning of the period. Okay? So 10,000 units that have all of their materials are 100% complete as far as materials go. So our equivalent units for those direct materials that have been transferred out and still in work in process is 50,000. They have all of their materials. We are not going to add any more materials to these puzzles, so we're not going to add any more cost. So out of the 50,000 units that we have to account for, it is the equivalent in materials of having 50,000 completed units. Even though 10,000 stay in work in process, they have all of their materials cost already. We're not adding any more to them. All right, so remember our text told us we're going to break the cost down into two separate costs, the materials and the conversion. Okay, so conversion includes labor and overhead. So I need to calculate equivalent units for direct materials and I need equivalent units for conversion cost because they're different. All right, so for the conversion cost, obviously, if the puzzles are completed, then they should have 100% of their conversion cost. So these puzzles that are ready to move in the next apartment have 100% of their conversion costs. They have 100% of their direct materials. And so 40,000 units that are complete are the equivalent of 40,000 completed units. It's that simple. What we have to work on is the 10,000. The 10,000 that are staying in work in process. Okay, we need equivalent units for 1 direct materials and we need equivalent units for 2 conversion cost. Once again, we said that those 10,000 units, these 10,000 units that are in work in process, they have 100% of their materials cost. So for materials, that it is the equivalent of having 10,000 completed units. All the materials are there. On the other hand, for the conversion cost, I think your text tells you that these units that were in work in process had only incurred 25% of the cost that they're going to incur. Okay, they're only 25%, excuse me for the sloppiness here, but they're only 25% complete. So if I have 10,000 units that only have 25% of their material and labor, these conversion costs, then that is the equivalent of having 2,500 finished goods, or the equivalent of 2,500 finished goods for material and labor. And so when we add these together, we come up with 42,500 equivalent units. Okay, these are the units that the equivalent of completed units that we have to account for. Right? This is important, okay, because we want to calculate cost per unit, and I need completed units or the equivalent of completed units to be able to do that. So when we move to the next step in assigning these costs, take a look at what we have. Your text tells you in this particular example that we had, let's see, $208,000 worth of cost that we need to account for. Okay, so we can see that here. We had $208,000 worth of material and labor because there were no transferred in cost here. Okay, so we have $208,000 of material and labor and overhead that we have to account for. We have to break that $208,000 into material and into conversion cost. Your book tells you that $140,000 relates to material and $68,000 relates to conversion cost. They give it to you. Here are two numbers. Out of the 208, 68 is overhead and labor, 140 is direct materials. But I have to spread these costs out, okay, among the units that have been completed here and among those that are going to stay in work in process. Because the units that have been completed are going to get transferred out to the next department. So I have to figure out how to get these costs from here to here. And the way we do that is total cost divided by the equivalent units of production. Okay, so remember we said that out of the 50,000 units that were taking place in this process, this period, even the 40,000 that are complete have all their materials, and the 10,000 that are in work in process have all of their materials. So all of the costs for materials have already been added to this department. So we have the equivalent of 50,000 completed goods. So if I take the total materials cost of 140,000 and I divide it by the equivalent unit, the equivalent of finished units 50,000, then my cost per unit for materials is $2.80 per equivalent units produced. Okay, so now I've determined the cost per unit for materials by determining the equivalent units, by determining the total cost. Now I have my cost per unit. Let's do the same thing for conversion cost. If I have $68,000 in conversion cost, we calculated that those units that were complete, okay, they had all of their labor and overhead for 40,000 units, but the 10,000 that were still in process were only 25% complete. So that was only 2,500, the equivalent of 2,500 finished units in the conversion process. So the equivalent of finished units for conversion cost was 42,500. So if we take our total cost and we divide by 42,500, we find that the equivalent, our cost per unit, a cost per equivalent unit for conversion cost is $1.60 per unit. We add these. It costs $2.80 per unit to process these puzzles in the assembly department, and it costs $1.60 per unit in labor and overhead to process these puzzles in the assembly department. So if we add these two numbers together, we get our total cost per unit, $4.40. Okay, so notice that we couldn't simply take the 208,000 and divide it by by 50,000. Okay, because not all 50,000 have the same related or associated cost tied to them, because some were complete, some were not. Thus, we had to come back and figure out the cost per equivalent unit for materials, the cost per equivalent unit for conversion cost, to come up with our total cost per equivalent unit in the assembly department. What am I going to do with these numbers now? I have to determine what cost get transferred out of the assembly department and to the next department when they're completed, and what costs stay in the assembly department while they are still in work in process. And this is what happens in the next chapter or the next slide. So what we see is if we have 40,000 units completed, then 40,000 times $2.80 per unit will give us the cost of those goods that have been completed. This is the cost for materials that needs to move into the next process. The 10,000 that are still in process, if we take 10,000 times 280, all right, that is the cost that needs to stay in the assembly department for work in process. We're going to do the same thing for the conversion cost, the 40,000 times $1.60 each. That's the cost of completed units that needs to move out of this process and into the next process. The equivalent of 2,500 units there are 10,000 units that are left in work in process, which is the equivalent of 2,500 for conversion cost, 25% complete. So 2,500 times the 160 will tell me what costs need to stay in this department because they have not been completed. So once again, using the process cost report to track the number of units that I need to account for and the number of costs that I need to account for, I can determine what costs get transferred out to the next department, and I can calculate what costs need to remain in work in process. And as you can see, we have calculated 176 that needs to move into the next process, $32,000 that needs to stay in work in process for the assembly department, which completes the $208,000 total cost that I need to be accountable for in this particular process. Okay, so to sum this up for what's going on in this particular department, as I've just said, the costs that are finished will move out of. So we'll see that they're going to go out of. They will move out of the assembly department and they will move into the cutting department. And when they do, they get moved over as transferred in cost. And we're simply using the weighted average method to calculate the amount of those costs that get transferred into the next period. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information about equivalent units for the assembly department. So I want us to take a brief break. I want you to go back, make some notes if you would like, flip back through your text and make notes as you would like to try to get an understanding of how we track units, equivalent units, cost, and then how we transfer those costs to the next department. Then come back and we're going to go through the process one more time. Hopefully this one will move a little quicker since you've already seen it once, but we'll go through this process one more time to see the same illustration of those costs once they get moved to the next department.